The legislature passed a comprehensive reform in 2018 to improve the lives of children. The Office of Children's Services did not follow the law. They did not follow almost any of those reforms. They treated them as optional. And if they told you, gosh, this is hard, we're not going to do it, I'm sorry. You do not get to do that. You do not get to look 2,500 foster youth in the eye and say, hey, there was a law. It was meant to improve your lives. It was just hard, so we didn't do it. That does not work, Andrew. That does not work at all.
The OCS director at the time went on record and said, if this bill does not pass and we don't do this, children will die. And guess what has happened as a result of challenges with workforce? Children have passed.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. Today's podcast is structured a bit differently than our other episodes. We are discussing the third and final legislative audit of the Alaska Office of Children's Services that was made public on June 30th of this year. In 2018, an omnibus bill was signed into law that completely overhauled the way foster care in Alaska should work. That bill, House Bill 151, passed the Alaska State House and the Alaska Senate unanimously. House Bill 151 was the product of years of hard work by many people, especially the guests on our show today, Bill's sponsor, former Representative Gara of downtown Anchorage, and Amanda Metivier, the executive director of Facing Foster Care in Alaska. I'm now going to play some audio from the Senate debate from May 9th, 2018. You will hear from the following legislators: John Coghill, Republican from North Pole; Anna McKinnon, Republican from Eagle River; Peter Machicki, Republican from Kenai; and from the Senate President Pete Kelly, Republican from Fairbanks.
Senator Coghill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it's my privilege to carry House Bill 151 for the member from the other body. Part of the conundrum is the caseloads are very high, and the workers work in the Office of Children's Services turn over very, very rapidly for a variety of reasons. This is a kind of a demanded response. It's probably as best a guided response as we can find.
Senator McKinnon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of House Bill 151. And Mr. President, the bill before us sets caseload standards. It sets training standards. Also, as the previous speaker said, is a huge attempt at reducing turnover. Senate Finance has offered an audit provision in the bill that requires the department to cooperate.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I also rise in support of the bill. Mr. President, I'd like to move and ask unanimous consent to list you as a co-sponsor of HB 151.
Thank you. Without objection, I will be added as a co-sponsor along with Senator Giesel, Senator McKinnon, Senator Machicki, Senator Stedman, Senator Stevens, Senator Bishop, Senator Costello, Senator Hoffman, Gardner, Hughes, Egan, Olson, Wilikowski, Wilson, Coghill, Meyer. Fun name off. I guess that's all of us, isn't it?
As you heard in the audio I just played, everyone wanted this bill to be signed into law. Everyone wanted it implemented, and they were so committed that an audit was required to make sure that OCS followed through. That audit is complete. Here are excerpts from the first 4 paragraphs of the third audit. The audit concluded that foster care reform did not effectively increase services for Alaskan children. Implementation of House Bill 151 failed to resolve the Office of Children's Services labor challenges, despite the legislature appropriating over $20.7 million of additional funding and authorizing 110 new frontline caseworker and support positions. High vacancies and turnover led to excess budgetary authority, which was used in part for other purposes. Limits, referred to as caseload caps, could not be fully implemented due to a lack of workers. Of the 115 case-carrying workers, 80 workers, or 70%, exceeded the average caseload cap. As a result of House Bill 151, the number of training weeks increased from a minimum of 2 weeks to a minimum of 6 weeks. However, the training method switched from in-person to virtual. Around the same time training became virtual, OCS began hiring workers with, quote, core competencies, rather than hiring workers with college degree or prior work experience. The audit questions whether 5 weeks of virtual training and 1 week of mostly remote mentoring is adequate to turn new hires with core competencies into qualified frontline caseworkers. Amanda Metivier and Les Gara, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having us.
Welcome back, I should say. Why don't we start with each of you just talking about your big takeaways from the audit?
There's nothing in the audit that's surprising. These are things that Amanda and I have told either OCS or others for years. There never seemed to be any real intention of implementing the massive, comprehensive, bipartisan foster care reform that the legislature passed in 2018.
You know what? We should start there. So the audit was set up in your bill,
right?
Les Gara.
Yep.
House Bill 151 had a component that said that OCS would be audited to make sure that they were implementing the bill. The bill was an omnibus bill. It did many things, but essentially capping caseloads, hiring more caseworkers, increasing documentation for family searches, making sure that there was some sort of plan for kids who are leaving the system. We'll post a link to the summary of the bill. The bill did a lot of things. But the point is that you, through looking at the rest of the country, looking at what other systems had done, felt that this would be what OCS needed to do in Alaska to massively improve the outcomes of our foster system. So that kind of gets people up to speed. So now we're 2025, we're reviewing the 3-part audit that started in 2018.
A lot of this is it's social science. What works in other states? What is it that gives foster youth the chance to succeed in life and have the best chance to live a life free of trauma, full of success, so that foster youth have the same chances in the world as everybody else? And most states have failed at that. And so Amanda especially and we worked together. Amanda did a lot of the research, as did other experts, other national experts, to figure out what has worked in other states. We brought basically almost every one of those things to the state of Alaska and passed the most comprehensive foster care reform in state history. The bill was never implemented. So I think the first commissioner, Commissioner Crum, I think had some sympathy towards making the system work. He lasted about 2 years, and then everything fell apart starting about 2020. And from 2020 on, I think if you speak to people on the street who do work in the foster care system, they will say the system is now in the biggest crisis it's ever been. The neglect, the disregard for the law, the disregard for the interests of children, and putting the interest of cost savings above the interests of children. We're now so far away from where we need to be. But it's time to say, look, the legislature passed a law on a bipartisan basis unanimously. Not just unanimously, but every single senator stood up one by one and cross-sponsored the bill. I don't know if that's ever happened before, but it was so unique that that Senate President Pete Kelly, in a 15-5 Republican Senate, invited me over to say, you're going to want to watch this. And so he invited me in the gallery. One by one, every single Republican and Democratic senator stood up and sponsored the bill. It was bipartisan, right? So, I think there are people inside the department, some more political people inside the department that call this a Democratic bill. It was not a Democratic bill. I mean, huge portions of it were written by Republican members as the bill went through the process. It was everybody's bill, but it needs to be implemented, and it hasn't been. And that's basically the finding of the audit, that the major provisions have not been implemented.
Well, one thing I can say, carrying some foster care legislation, is that some of the most conservative, furthest right folks stand up and speak in support of protecting these most vulnerable youth. I mean, if there was ever a nonpartisan issue, it is making sure that foster kids are protected. Amanda.
Well, so to kind of tie into what Les said, when the effort was put in to research what would really work for Alaska leading up to the passage of HB 151, I mean, it was a decade of reform efforts, right? For these Band-Aids that folks would slap on, or that we would slap on over the years, to see what we could get in to support OCS in the way of beefing up the workforce, support for foster families, for youth. And so this was sort of the culmination of all of that. But it wasn't just a bipartisan effort in the legislature. It was experts across the country who had brought this to us. It was experts across the state. But it was also heavily supported by the state of Alaska. So at the time, the Office of Children's Services, the Department of Health and Social Services prior to the split said, this has to happen. And the OCS director at the time went on record and said, if this bill does not pass and we don't do this, children will die. And guess what has happened as a result of challenges with workforce? Children have passed, and it's not something you see in the news every day. But if you look up the Alaska Child Death Review, that's the result of challenges with workforce, challenges with training, and not implementing this law. And audit or not, right, we have these results now. HB 151 is still the law, and we still have to try to meet the mark to get to that caseload cap or that caseload standard. Because at the end of the day, we can't just throw up our hands and say, we don't have the workers. We don't have the workforce. We don't have enough people in Alaska to do the job. Like, we have to be really creative. When Alaska Psychiatric Institute was in crisis, what did the state do? They brought in an outside consulting firm to stabilize staffing, come up with a plan for workforce, and fix it. We can do the same thing. We can figure out creative solutions. When you pay somebody 20-something bucks an hour to do some of the most difficult work and lower the requirements so much that this could be their first full-time job, that's a huge detriment to families and to the safety of children across the state. And so our state has a responsibility, whether that's the governor or the department within, the administration within, to figure out a plan, because now we have these results and we can't just say, we don't have the workforce. We don't get to just march on and keep doing the same thing. The law is still the law, and there's a requirement to come up with a plan for hiring and figuring out the workforce.
So I've spoken with the department about the audits. I've read the first few paragraphs of the most recent audit, and it is very damning. Like, it's really just saying, like, hey, things are just as bad as they were before. But the audits themselves are a lot of pages. And when you dig into them, you find that some of the places where they failed wasn't that they weren't doing things, but they weren't documenting it properly. And so part of the pushback is like, no, we're doing these family searches. It may not have been documented exactly the way the auditor expected it, but we were doing them. I see you shaking your head. I want to just continue saying sort of what some of the pushback is from the department. So I, for one, if this is true, I can understand that if you are short-staffed, that, well, I'd rather you do the work and not document it properly than have perfect documentation of something that didn't happen. Now, when it talks about trying to overhire, because that was one of the solutions, was rather than having the staff functioning at like 65%, like let's go to 110%. We know there's going to be high turnover. We know, and this is a very difficult job and it's not for everybody. So let's overhire. There's a huge elephant in the room with COVID and how that kind of put a wrench in things. The bottom line is that I don't think getting rid of the degree requirement and going to a core competency model was the right solution. However, hindsight is 2020. I'd say at the time, let's figure out a way to hire as many people as possible to do this job. So if the degree is a barrier, let's remove that barrier and we'll do more training so that they learn how to do the job. Obviously, with COVID, allowing people to go on to a virtual training, I don't think that people can be trained online to go in and decide what kids should stay. And I mean, like, it's just a very difficult, emotional job. But again, they didn't have enough workers and they were trying to remove a barrier. So I can see that there is some nuance here. It's not just about OCS blatantly deciding not to follow new laws. They are able to make an argument that they were trying.
Okay, wait a second. The legislature passed a comprehensive reform in 2018 to improve the lives of children. The Office of Children's Services did not follow the law. They did not follow almost any of those reforms. They treated them as optional. And if they told you, gosh, this is hard, we're not going to do it, I'm sorry. You do not get to do that. You do not get to look 2,500 foster youth in the eye and say, hey, there was a law. It was meant to improve your lives. It was just hard, so we didn't do it. That does not work, Andrew. That does not work at all. That's their response, that it was hard, so they didn't do it. I'm sorry. Doing a good job is hard. But let's leave the law for a second. Nobody in the audience is going to be able to go through a 50-page bill and understand every one of the state-of-the-art reforms that we adopted in this bill, right? We can't do that in a half hour. But let's just give you the basics. What they did starting in 2020 was say, we don't care if you have a college degree. You can decide whether or not to take a child away from a family. We don't care whether you have any training whatsoever in social work. You can decide whether or not to take a child away from a family. We don't care whether all you have is a high school degree and you just came out of high school and you have no work experience. You've never had a job in your life. We'll hire you at $26 an hour. You cannot change the job requirement from you need a social work degree or the equivalent in work experience. That was the old standard. And say, no, you don't need a social work degree anymore. You don't need a college degree anymore. You don't need any work experience anymore. You can be a 19-year-old who's never had a full-time job, never had a degree, never done any relevant work. And we're going to put you in charge of deciding whether or not to take a child away from a family. We're going to put you in charge of how to deal with that child's trauma. We're going to put you in charge of how to put that child's family back together. We're going to put you in charge of 30 different standards that you have to implement as a caseworker, including one of the best things you can do for a child if they're going to go into foster care is see if there's a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt, what we call a kinship family, who has a relationship with this child. So the child can be placed with that family before you place them with a strange family, before you take them from Bethel and send them to Anchorage. That was one of the provisions of the bill, find kinship families. You're going to tell a 19-year-old to do that? Who do they even know that that's a rule? You mentioned this. So one of the things that OCS is supposed to do is do a comprehensive search to see if there's a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle who can take care of the child. And what the audit found was OCS has never done this, and there's no documentation that they've ever done this. And now they're telling you, well, we didn't document it, but we did it. Doing it, that's a lot of work. Documenting it is like 2 minutes. They didn't document it because they didn't do it. The number of youth placed with aunts and grandparents and cousins and family members is about the same today as it was 7 years ago. They haven't done the work.
I just want to read what in the published audit one from November 2020. I'm going to quote from their finding, and this is the auditor. Auditors generally found that searches were conducted, but formal procedures and documentation were lacking. So I just want to say that's what the auditor found. So they did fault supervisors for not requiring certifying in writing, which was a statutory requirement of HB 151. So they're faulting the supervisor for not requiring that the law be followed. But they did note that those searches were conducted. So I'm just putting that on the record because that is what the audit said. I want to be fair. Something that came up when we did this interview the first time, and I am going to refer back to that because that interview that we did, where we talked about House Bill 151 and it not being implemented, there were people who were very upset about that podcast. I'm going to try to do this anonymously as possible, but bottom line, as somebody who worked at OCS for a very long time, supported the removal of the social work degree requirement because from their perspective, there are folks with a social work degree who are not suited for this job. And vice versa, knowing some of the things that you take classes in social work, like the history of social work in America, you don't need to know the history of social work in America in order to be able to do this job. So what this person was basically saying was like, there are people out there who are very good at this job who don't have that degree. And there are people with a degree who aren't good at this job.
Well, let me say a few things here. First, I teach that class. It's not history of social work in America. It's intro to social welfare. And I agree. People don't need an entire history on social welfare or social work to do the job, but they still need some foundational skills in understanding trauma and families, historical trauma in Alaska, substance use, right? Specific diagnoses that you might see often in parents, things like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, understanding the boarding school era, sort of all the things that bleed into our system now. When the state shifted to this mechanism of competency-based hiring, they didn't actually outline clear competencies. And so it was sort of a free-for-all. It was anyone was being hired. And I was previously in a role as the associate director and then the director of training at the university for OCS staff from 2021 up until February of this year. And so what I saw were brand new staff coming in the door who, one, didn't know the job they were hired to do. Some were showing up on the first day and they thought that they were working childcare or to be a security guard because the name of the position was protective service specialist. Others who didn't know they were going to have to go into homes or knock on doors. And so it goes much further than competencies. It's about both the selling, right, of the job and people understanding what they're applying for, but then what are the competencies of this role? What do you need to be qualified to do if it's not having a degree? And then once you're in the door for a very long time, and it, I think, was heavily related to turnover and a lot of the institutional knowledge and people who have been around for a long time leaving, there wasn't an onboarding process internally. Mm-hmm. And so what you had were people being hired who didn't have a phone line, who didn't have an email connection or even a computer, who were now expected to come and sit on screen with training staff for 8 hours. We know what the screen does to our brains and the expectation for learning, but we're throwing people not only into training that wasn't really the best setup already, they didn't know the job that they were hired to do.
Right. And I want to say that was something that was pointed out by the person from OCS who was upset about your first interview, that in their experience, folks had showed up for their first day of work and did not know that they had to complete paperwork, didn't know how to complete the paperwork. So this person said, so the solution is we need mentorship. We need folks to not arrive on the first day and be expected to go do things. We need somebody walking through with them. They need to be sort of shadowing and having this more type, which I think might have been their intent, and then it got thrown out the window with COVID, or maybe that's their excuse, but that there was no real mentorship happening.
There's a formal mentor team. Les got that money in the budget long before 151. And so OCS actually has special positions that are they're called mentors. And they partner with training. And so staff get hired, they come through training. Ideally, they get their first case right after they've had some training under their belt. That doesn't necessarily happen either. Every new staff is assigned a mentor. And those mentors travel around the state. They work one-on-one with staff. And that was a provision that Les got in long before 151 because it was something that was proven in Idaho and Washington and other states around the country. Again, what has happened? There's been turnover in the mentor team, budgetary constraints, but the same things happened for training. Training went virtual in 2020 at the onset of the pandemic. The state hasn't moved training back to in-person classroom style training, which wasn't perfect prior to the pandemic, but turnover wasn't as high.
Mm-hmm. This is foster care on the cheap. So it's the tail wagging the dog. They wanted to keep the salary as low as possible, $26 an hour. Why would you apply for a high-stress job when you can go over across the street and work at a retail job and get the same pay? So their problem is they wanted to pay people as little as possible, $26 an hour. Well, can you get somebody with a master's in social work at $26 an hour? No. Can you get somebody educated in childhood trauma at $26 an hour? No. Can you get somebody who understands family dynamics and how to keep a family together and how to get the services to a family so they can take their child back and not have the kid in foster care anymore? You're not going to get that person at $26 an hour. When we passed this law, the standard for hiring was what it had been for a very long time. Social work degree. Your source at OCS says, well, some social workers aren't very good. That's true. You don't hire that person. There's no law that said just because you had a social degree, you have to be hired. You have to be a good candidate. So for them to say, well, some social workers aren't very good, that's
But
fine.
I mean, I guess if they're super understaffed and they need 20 and they have 10 people apply, how are they going to say no to 2 of them?
The problem there is the $26 an hour. It's not that you were requiring somebody to be competent. The having somebody to be competent was a good part of the hiring process. The decision to try and hire as many people at $26 an hour as you could, they could not get the workforce. They had job vacancies. They could not get competent people to take the job. So they lowered the standard for hiring somebody to no college, no work experience with families, never having done any research on childhood trauma, having no experience whatsoever with the family protection system, so that you could now hire somebody who had never had a job before. See, they call it competency-based hiring. That's a word, right? But there's no competency required in the job standard.
Right.
That is wrong. And what they should have done is dumped this whole idea of the entry-level protective service worker who has no experience and no knowledge and hired the more senior social worker twos, right? And at a higher salary, you get a more competent person. I'm sorry if it costs more. I'm sorry that to decide how to limit the amount of trauma a child suffers and give them a better chance in this world, you can't do it $26 an hour. I'm really sorry about that, but you can't. And you can't blame the people who aren't qualified. They weren't trained. They never had the background. It's not their fault. Let's just read from the audit. Without a rigorous training program that applies theory to real-life practice, caseworkers may not be adequately prepared to provide services, which may contribute to high turnover and lower outcomes. The combination of hiring people with no experience and then not training them.
You know what I want to talk about? I want to go to the second audit, the one published in November 2023, when they talked about the lack of foster care licenses being issued to kinship placements. This is a very tenuous issue. Like, let's say you found a family member who's willing to be the foster parent for this kid. How aggressively does OCS force that particular kinship placement to do the licensing requirements?
Well, I can speak to some of the licensing and why this was even put in. So the idea that first the process would be sped up to license relatives. And
going
so
to 45 days.
What we were hearing for a very long time, and I know Les and other lawmakers heard this consistently over the years, and we heard it from young people, and we heard it from relative providers, was that they'd fill out the application and they would never hear back. And so we thought, if we put a timeline on this, right?
So the goal was to increase the processing of the license. It wasn't that folks weren't applying.
Speed it up, right? And then ideally, license more relatives.
Right.
There's two options when someone comes on as a relative. They can be an unlicensed relative care provider to the children in OCS custody. Some choose to do that for very good reason. They don't want to deal with OCS licensing. They don't want to deal with all the requirements that come with that or the sort of poking and prodding into their lives, right? Oftentimes, folks who stand up for their relatives are already in a difficult situation. If this is their sibling's kid or their grandkids, or obviously their family dynamics that come into play. The other side of it is they can choose to go through the licensing process like any foster parent would. Most foster parents who sign up to do foster care want to work with the state, right? They want their background to be checked. They want to come through training. They want to open their home.
I wouldn't say they want to, but they're willing.
They're willing, right? Like there's an eagerness to standing in and helping take care of children. Oftentimes relatives are being asked to do something very difficult, and there's a lot of unknown that comes with that. Typically on an emergency basis, right? You get a call, you have this relative, will you take this child? Turn your whole life upside down. Do you have room in your house? So the idea behind this provision of the bill was to speed up that process to get relative license. In the background, there are a whole host of challenges that come with this. You'll hear about fingerprints and the delay in fingerprints, both travel to and the equipment to do it, especially in very rural communities. That's delayed the process for all foster parents, not just relatives. A lot of our systems are ancient, but I think it also goes back to lack of investment in this system. So you were talking about relative search and saying that is happening. Somebody's not checking the box to certify. Again, relative search maybe is happening, but in what way? OCS also has very limited tools in the way of relative search. There's no policy around use of social media, and it's allowed by word of mouth in some communities in the state and some not. But limited access to PFD database. So what are the tools caseworkers actually use to do a relative search? There are states that have robust investment in relative search and tracking folks and identifying people that we are very far behind. And again, it's all for lack of investment in. We could pay for tools for relative search. We could pay for tools for folks to be able to move more quickly through the licensing process. But again, there's no money, right? There's no money behind whatever it is to do it.
Some of it's not very expensive. So it's sad that they would say they're doing a relative search, even though the supervisors have not confirmed they're doing any relative search, right? I mean, let's go back. A kid would love to live with their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles before they're moved to another city to live with a strange family. It's better to stay in the family if you have a good aunt, uncle. And so the national standard for doing a relative search, I mean, how do you do it? I mean, you get a 20-year-old and they're like, how do I find a relative for this parent who's angry at me and won't even talk to me, right? You use social media. So the national standard, and there's a nonprofit in California, and this is what they do. That you pay them $40, they'll do this for you. You go on Facebook, And for anybody who has a public profile, you can find, oh my God, they just mentioned a sister. Oh my God, they just mentioned a grandparent, and that's that grandparent's name. Oh my God, look at the friends list. There's the grandparent, there's the aunt, there's the uncle. What OCS has said is we refuse to use Facebook because it's an invasion of privacy. So they are not doing the relative searches, even if they say they are. And it is not an invasion of privacy to look at somebody's public Facebook page. I can look at it. You can look at it. If somebody wants privacy, they set it as in a private setting. There is no law. The statute says a comprehensive relative search. They are not doing a comprehensive relative search.
There's also a bill moving through the legislature right now, sponsored by Senator Bjorkman, and I don't agree with everything in that bill, but part of what has happened as a direct result of identifying family late is there are frustrated foster parents around the state who have had infants and young children for several years, and now a grandmother has been identified, or an aunt, or a cousin. And that means pretty immediate shift to placement with this relative. And so there is a group of foster parents that's pushing that legislation to say attachment and bonding for these children trumps, right, the trauma of moving to now be with their relative. And so now there's a push in our own legislature to move more quickly toward permanency with foster parents versus family, because family wasn't identified soon enough. And other states have moved to this: Kentucky, Arizona, Alabama, and it's gaining traction here, and that's a scary thing.
It's very scary. So it's basically saying the state's not doing its due diligence, and so we're going to just allow the child to be adopted by a foster family because we didn't actually look for a family.
It alters the placement preference sequence. And so in, I want to say 2010, there was a bill that passed by the late Senator Davis, and it made it so that all children in foster care met the same standard that was outlined in the Indian Child Welfare Act, to say that children go with relatives first, and then a family friend, and then maybe someone they knew, or a teacher or coach, then stranger foster care. And so what this bill would do would bump up foster parents to be that first preference, right in line with parents for children of a certain age who had been in foster care for a certain period of time. And it would limit the time a relative could come forward after notice. And that's a direct result, again, of children lingering out in the system, and with good reason. Foster parents who are frustrated.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that were brought up in Rachel Cassandra's reporting from Alaska Public Media this week. And she talked about Deco Harvey's experience. Deco was placed with her sister, and it was a terrible placement. Sure. One thing that's outlined in Deco's experience that really comes down to the lack of hiring of caseworkers is that no one came to visit. No one came to visit to see the situation. And it states in the article that OCS workers are required to do home visits with kids at their placements every month. Deco said that they never came to check on her and her siblings. And I believe that from my own experience. I mean, like having had a foster child that we eventually adopted. And again, I don't want to fault the caseworker. I know that they have a hard job and they have too many cases, but
they have 50% more cases than the law requires.
But there is a feeling as a foster parent that no one was checking in, and then you just sort of feel left out in the cold.
The law does not require that you place somebody with a grandparent if it's not in the best interest of the child. The standard in foster care is the placement, and everything we do should be in the best interest of the child. So we would never place somebody with a grandparent who has a substance abuse problem just because they're a grandparent. Of course, there are going to be kinship placements that don't make sense, right? Is it a good kinship placement? But you're supposed to look for the good kinship placements.
I also think it could be a good kinship placement if they have the right support. So if somebody's checking in to say, what do you need? Somebody shows up and sees that the house is dirty, or that it's an overwhelmed individual, or these children have special needs, or are moving forward with the grief and trauma of their parent not being present. That can be caught a lot sooner and maybe mitigated, right? Maybe there's resources and support that could be offered early on. And I know.
Yeah, and I don't want to badmouth Deco's sister.
Yeah.
More support being provided may have changed that outcome for that family. I think a 23-year-old sister being responsible for multiple younger siblings, that's not something that the average 23-year-old is prepared for and knows how to do, to suddenly become a parent of multiple younger siblings.
And I think prepared or not, whether it's a relative or a foster parent in general. I mean, I fostered for 15 years off and on. And I remember going 7 months without a visit from a caseworker until we complained to management. And then she was frustrated that she had to do a visit. If you're going to remove a child from their parents and say, you're not safe here, the state has the ultimate duty to ensure then those children are safe in foster care, in residential facilities, with relatives, regardless of where they are. That's the point of child protection, is child safety.
Part of the bill was to make sure that workers had a manageable caseload. We'd been giving people who can handle 12 cases, 50 cases.
Right.
Right?
No one can do 50
So you're not
cases.
going to do a home visit. You're not going to know anything about the child. You're not going to know anything about the parent. You're not going to know anything about how to get the kid into an adoptive home. You're not going to know anything. And then you quit your job because you turn over. There's 50% turnover of workers every single year. So then that worker leaves, and the new worker doesn't know the kid, and the new worker doesn't get to know the family. And by the time that new worker gets to know who the kid is, the name, then they leave. And then you get a new worker. And so these kids languish in foster care longer than that is healthy for them. So provisions of the bill that have never been implemented. The caseload standard, so workers are given a manageable caseload so they can do the home visits and do the work. The average caseload is 50% higher than that is required by the law. The 6 weeks of training so we can train new workers. We don't do 6 weeks of training to save money. They're doing 6 weeks of Zoom meetings. That violates the law. And those are two things put together, this hiring of people with no job experience.
And then not training them.
And then not training them. That caused the audit to say, this is woefully insufficient for the majority of new hires, which is a major contributor to turnover among recently hired frontline workers.
Right.
That's in the audit. Okay? Woefully insufficient is not the kind of foster care system you're supposed to run. When you hand the state the gold standard for what will give children a chance in this world, look, the legislature did the work. I'm not going to say Amanda and I did the work. The legislature did the work. Senator von Imhoff had her own interests, and she studied those. And Senator McKinnon had her interests, and she studied those. And various Republicans and Democrats had ideas that made the bill better. And so we took the gold standard from across the country, the best provisions that worked across the country, and some very good provisions that local Alaska legislators added, which is why it passed unanimously and was signed right away. And we gave that blueprint to the state, and the state lit it on fire from 2020 on. And in addition, you mentioned there's slush money over at OCS, about $6 million a year, $4 to $6 million a year, that is dedicated to hiring qualified workers. OCS is taking in and spending on penalties. They're taking it and spending on other things. And that's what this audit finds too, is $4 to $6 million a year that is supposed to be going into hiring a qualified workforce that OCS is using for other stuff. Okay? Please, we're losing foster parents left and right. We have possibly the greatest shortage of foster parents in state history right now, because the state also is not following the mandate of the bill to recruit foster families in times of shortage. And we're in a major time of shortage. That's another provision OCS is violating.
I did hear an ad on the radio for foster parents, I guess, before Christmas of last year. So they did something.
It's very limited. So when I was in the legislature and Amanda and I worked together, we put money in the budget to do advertising campaigns and say, look, we could use you if the time is right in your life to be a foster parent. And people responded. Alaskans are generous when they know there's a problem. These ads that we see right now, 2 a.m, or the feds are doing them. They're either federal ads, if you look closely, or if there's a state ad, it's one of those sort of free ads that you get at 2 a.m. The state's not putting money into recruiting, and recruiting doesn't have to cost money. When the governor is in front of 300 people, when the commissioner is in front of 300 people, they can say, by the way, we have a major shortage on the foster care system. It could be an oil and gas conference. It could be a labor conference. We don't say you have to spend money on recruiting foster families. We say you have to recruit foster families. They could easily have a handout at every single meeting they go to and say, by the way, I thank you for your attention. We have a major shortage of foster families. There are kids who could really use you. Is this the right time of your life to be a foster parent?
Unfortunate consequence of this audit is that it certainly doesn't encourage people to stand up to be a part of the system. It doesn't encourage somebody who's considering being a foster parent to come in at this moment because there's all this publicity about how badly it's working. And so I always feel like I have to do what you just said. And I have to say, like, hey, as a former foster parent, I'll say it was the greatest thing I ever did. It's changed my life in the most astounding ways. And I'm so grateful. And I don't want people out there to not step up and do this because it's the best thing you'll ever do.
Yeah.
Amanda?
And the system, regardless if turnover is high or there's a budget or not, right, to meet the needs of children and our state in general, if you look at education, if you look at child care, right, if you look at our child welfare system across the board, there's a massive lack of investment in children and in families. I think we all want Alaska to be this great place to live and to raise a family. And we're limited in a lot of ways in that. But I think in general, child welfare systems are set up only to work if the community functions and gives back into that. And it's really unique to have a government system that relies on the community. But foster care doesn't work without foster parents. And relative care doesn't work unless relatives are willing to show up and do something harder than maybe they wanted or expected, right, for their own family. But there's other things that folks can do that aren't as difficult as being a foster parent. I often hear from people who say, I've always kind of thought about doing it, but I don't know. And they can sign up to be a mentor. Les worked, again, long before 151 to get funding support in the budget for mentors through Big Brothers Big Sisters. And so there's a program for that specifically for foster youth. And that's hanging out with a young person, maybe like once a week as they transition homes or schools or sort of figure out what's next in their life. That's one stable person that gets to follow them.
And that's a good baby step.
Yes.
You can call them Big Brothers Big Sisters today and say, I'd like to be a foster youth mentor. And they have something called the SYNC program, and they'll put you and they'll make you a foster youth mentor.
I will drop a link in the show notes. Hey, one last thing I want to say, again, because I felt like I had to do this last time too. So we've made a pitch for foster parents. We've made a pitch for Big Brothers Big Sister. I feel like we have to make a pitch to be an OCS caseworker.
I went to school to become a social worker because I had a great caseworker at OCS, right? I had someone that was able to show up for me, show up for my sister, show up for my family, and ensure that my needs were met. You know, like I have a relationship with my parents because of that. I have a relationship with my foster family because of that, right? And this was a very much qualified, right, individual with a social work degree, but who was able to not just manage a caseload, right, but make a real investment in a family. And for me, that changed the entire trajectory of my life.
Yeah, I wanted to say, we have those folks at OCS now. We have folks working.
There are some amazing people.
There are
at
some
OCS.
amazing people. But when somebody's given 3 times more of the cases than they can handle, it doesn't matter how competent they are. It doesn't matter how big their heart is. They simply can't do the job the way they'd want to do it because it's just not possible.
Unlike my caseworker, so I had a caseworker who by everything I could tell had time to spend with me. I saw her every few weeks, and she was so invested in my success that when I got married in 1990, she traveled 5,000 miles to come to my wedding. These are the kinds of jobs that caseworkers want.
Can I just say, my child's caseworker in California, who was our final caseworker who did the adoption, we get Facebook messages from her every year.
Yeah.
She wants to watch that 3-year-old when he's 12, like see what, see him succeeding.
You asked Amanda what would it take to make this thing succeed. Christy Lawton, who was the OCS director when this bill passed, knew that she could actually take this bill in a very positive way and recruit new workers by saying, in Texas, you're going to have 30, 40 cases per social worker. I mean, that's going to burn you out. Come to Alaska where you're only going to have 13. We have caseload limits here. We have training here. We have resources here. We have provisions in this bill that passed that make your job easier so you have more time to do social work. So Christy Lawton saw the bill as a positive way to actually recruit people. This is the place where you'll be able to do social work. And that's what we should be doing, is saying this is the place where you're able to do social work. Instead of saying, let's do this on the cheap and see what happens. We've done that. It's not working. Okay, let's just stop that. It's not working. And then I would invite OCS to actually take advantage of the provisions that reduce the work for their caseworkers, which they haven't, and that reduce the burden on foster families.
Amanda Metivier and Les Gara, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Alaska faces a severe shortage of licensed foster care parents. To learn more about how to be a foster parent, please click on the link in the show notes. To learn more about Les and Amanda's personal experiences as children in the foster system, listen to their previous appearance on the podcast. There's a link in the show notes. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklike.gov or call 907-269-0123.